October 25th, 1944. Off Samar Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Yukio Seki banks his Mitsubishi Zero into a screaming dive, the ocean rushing up beneath him at 300 miles per hour. Below, an American escort carrier, wooden deck gleaming like a child's toy, presents itself as the perfect sacrifice. No armor, no defense, just plywood and canvas stretched over a converted merchant hull. The Japanese have a name for these ships, mokuzō no hitsugi, wooden coffins. Today, he will prove it. But the USS Kalinin Bay is about to rewrite everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believes about American ingenuity. The intelligence briefing comes 3 weeks before the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in a dim hangar on Mabalacat Airfield, Luzon. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stands before a gathering of naval aviators, his face carved from stone, his eyes reflecting the bitter mathematics of a losing war. Behind him, pinned to a corkboard, reconnaissance photographs show the American fleet. Sleek Essex-class carriers with armored flight decks, their steel surfaces photographed mid-operation, capable of shrugging off bombs that would cripple lesser vessels. But it's the other photographs that draw cruel laughter from the assembled pilots. "Look at these," one pilot mutters, jabbing a finger at an image of CV-68, USS Kalinin Bay. The ship is small, barely 500 feet long, with a flight deck that appears almost fragile in the grainy black and white shot. Casablanca class, built for merchant hulls. The Americans are so desperate they're sending freighters to fight us. The laughter spreads. These escort carriers, called jeep carriers by their own crews, are mass-produced vessels, churned out by Kaiser shipbuilding at a rate of 1 per week. They lack the heavy armor of fleet carriers. Their flight decks constructed from wooden planking laid over a thin steel framework. To Japanese pilots trained to respect the formidable Yorktown and Enterprise-class carriers, these CVs seem like an insult. "Wooden decks," another pilot says, shaking his head. "They might as well paint targets on them." Onishi doesn't smile. He knows what these men don't yet understand, that they're looking at their own deaths in those photographs. The tokubetsu kōgeki Tai, special attack units, aren't being formed because Japan is winning. They're being formed because Japan has already lost. The escort carriers are simply the designated recipients of that loss, the targets chosen not for their weakness, but for their abundance. "You will aim for these vessels," Onishi says quietly. The escort carriers, they protect the invasion fleets. They provide air cover for landing operations. And yes, they are lightly armored. Your aircraft will penetrate their decks. Your fuel and ordnance will ignite their hangar decks. 1 aircraft, 1 carrier. This is the exchange rate we need. The math is simple. Japan has lost hundreds of trained pilots. The replacements have perhaps 40 hours of flight time, barely enough to take off and land, let alone engage in aerial combat. But pointing a plane at a ship and diving, that requires no skill, only will. And so the doctrine is born. Strike the soft targets. The escort carriers with their wooden decks, the transports with their unarmored hulls. Trade 1 plane, 1 life, for maximum disruption. The strategy relies on a fundamental assumption that American construction shortcuts have created vulnerabilities that Japanese determination can exploit. In the weeks that follow, the assumption hardens into certainty. Intelligence reports detail the Casablanca-class specifications. 10,000-ton displacement, powered by reciprocating steam engines, salvaged from merchant service, armed with a single 5-inch gun and a handful of anti-aircraft mounts. The flight deck is described in technical terms that sound damning. Douglas fir planking, 3 inches thick, laid over a steel frame with minimal armor protection. They won't even feel the impact. Lieutenant Seki tells his fellow pilots over sake one night, "We'll go straight through, like a sword through paper." Seki is 23 years old, a former university student who volunteered for the Navy in 1943. He's one of the better trained pilots in the Shikishima unit, with actual combat experience over the Philippines. He understands aerodynamics, gunnery, navigation. But even he has bought into the narrative that American desperation has created an opportunity, that the wooden deck carriers are floating pyres waiting to be lit. None of them have considered the alternative, that the Americans might have learned something from 3 years of war, that wooden decks might be a feature rather than a flaw, that sometimes what looks like weakness is actually adaptation. Dawn breaks over Leyte Gulf on October 25th, 1944, at 0645 hours. The sky is cloudless. The sea a sheet of hammered silver. Task Unit April 3rd, 77, call sign Taffy 3. Steams in a defensive screen 20 miles east of Samar Island. 6 escort carriers form the core. USS Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kikun Bay, and Gamber Bay. Around them, 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts maintain anti-submarine patrol patterns. Aboard USS Kalinin Bay, Ensign Hans Jensen stands on the wooden flight deck, supervising the fueling of an FM-2 Wildcat fighter. The deck crew works efficiently despite the early hour, rolling fuel hoses across the fur planking, securing tie-down chains, running pre-flight checks. The wood beneath Jensen's boots is worn smooth from months of operations, the grain visible through layers of non-skid paint. It flexes slightly when aircraft land, a sensation that took him weeks to get used to. But it's held up through everything. Tropical storms, rough seas, even a fire in June that scorched a 10-foot section black. Feels like standing on a dock. Jensen had told a friend when he first reported aboard. Now he doesn't notice it. The Kalinin Bay is home, a cramped, noisy, perpetually humid home that smells of aviation fuel and salt spray. But home nonetheless. At 0646 hours, everything changes. The lookout in the port catwalk spots them first. Pagoda masts on the horizon, bristling with gun barrels. Then more ships. Then more. Battleships. Heavy cruisers. Destroyers. Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan has sent to sea in a year, bearing down on Taffy 3 at 30 knots. General quarters. General quarters. All hands man your battle stations. The alarm screams through every compartment. Jensen sprints for his station in sky control, hard hammering. This isn't supposed to happen. The big gun battleships are supposed to be somewhere else, deterred by Halsey's fast carriers. Taffy 3 has no armor, no heavy weapons, nothing that can scratch a Yamato-class battleship. The entire task unit couldn't sink one Japanese cruiser if they concentrated all their fire. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, Ziggy to his men, makes the only decision available run. The escort carriers turn east, their reciprocating engines straining to produce 18 knots, smoke generators flooding the air with thick chemical fog. The destroyers charge west, straight at the Japanese fleet, launching torpedoes and suicidal attack runs. It's heroic. It's desperate. It's completely insufficient. By 0720 hours, shells from Japanese heavy cruisers are falling around the escort carriers. 18-inch shells from the battleship Yamato create waterspouts 12 stories high, their splashes drenching the Kalinin Bay's flight deck. The wooden planking shudders with each near miss, splinters flying where shrapnel fragments strike. One shell passes so close to the carrier's stern that the crew feels the heat from its passage. Gamber Bay takes the worst of it. Direct hits from heavy cruiser main batteries. Her thin hull ruptured, flooding uncontrollably. She lists to port, aircraft sliding off her deck into the sea, and at 0907 hours she capsizes. The first American carrier sunk by surface gunfire since the war began. The Kalinin Bay survives the gunfire by luck and smoke. But at 1045 hours, as the Japanese fleet inexplicably withdraws, mistaking the escort carriers for fleet carriers, fearing non-existent torpedo attacks, a new threat appears. 16 Mitsubishi Zeros, Nakajima-ki, 43 Oscars, and Yokosuka D-4 Judy dive bombers drop from the clouds. White scarves stream from cockpits. Rising sun insignia flash crimson. Every aircraft is aimed at a single purpose. The first kamikaze attack of the Battle of Leyte Gulf is about to begin. Lieutenant Yukio Seiki leads the formation and is zero modified for this moment. Fuel tanks filled to capacity. All unnecessary weight stripped away. A 250-kilogram bomb secured to the centerline hardpoint. The cockpit smells of oil and metal. The stick vibrates in his hands. Below, the American escort carriers are scattering, but there are so many targets that it doesn't matter. He picks the nearest one, a Casablanca class with white hull numbers, CV-68, USS Kalinin Bay. All aircraft. Seiki transmits. Select your targets. For the Emperor. For Japan. He pushes the stick forward. The Zero screams toward the ocean, engine howling, the carrier growing from a toy to a ship to a world that fills his windscreen. Anti-aircraft fire laces the sky. 40mm Bofors tracers, 20mm Oerlikon streams, 5-inch shells bursting in black flowers. But Seiki's vision narrows to a tunnel. Just the wooden deck. Just the impact point. He pulls up slightly at the last second, aiming for the center of the flight deck. The impact comes at 1,047 hours. Seiki's Zero strikes the Kalinin Bay's flight deck at a shallow angle, just aft of the number 2 elevator. The 250-kilogram bomb detonates on contact, blowing a hole 15 feet wide through the wooden planking. Burning aviation fuel sprays across the deck. The Zero's engine block punches through to the gallery deck below, crushing a 20mm gun mount and killing 3 sailors instantly. Smoke boils from the wound, black and greasy, visible for miles. Damage Control Central receives the report within seconds. Frame 110, flight deck penetration. Fire on gallery deck. Casualties unknown. Lieutenant Commander Paul Crissy, the ship's damage control officer, is already moving. He's a former merchant marine officer, trained in firefighting on civilian vessels, where speed matters more than protocol. He reaches the scene as crewmen are deploying hoses, their faces black with soot. Get that fire out before it reaches the aviation fuel stores. Crissy shouts. Foam, not water foam. The fire teams respond with practiced efficiency. But what Crissy sees makes him pause. The hole in the flight deck is massive. The wooden planking is shredded. The steel framing beneath exposed and twisted. But the fire isn't spreading horizontally. It's burning straight down, through the destroyed section, not outward along the deck. On a steel deck carrier, the burning aviation fuel would spread across the metal surface, pooling and flowing, superheating the steel until it warped. Bombs would cook off. Ammunition would explode. The Essex-class carrier USS Franklin will burn for days after a bomb hit in March 1945, her armored steel deck conducting heat throughout the ship. But the Kalinin Bay's wooden deck is burning like a campfire, intensely in one spot, but contained. The fur planking is thick enough to absorb the initial impact energy, and where it burns, it creates its own fire break. The flames consume the wood, but don't spread beyond the damaged section. We can patch this, Crissy realizes aloud. Before the crew can contain the first fire, the second Kamikaze strikes. At 1,051 hours, a Nakajima Ki, 43 Oscar, hits the port side of the flight deck, 50 feet from the first impact point. This pilot is less experienced than Seiki. His angle is too steep, his speed too high, and the Oscar essentially disintegrates on impact. The aircraft's fuel tank ruptures, spraying burning gasoline across a 20-foot section of deck. But again, the wooden planking contains the damage. The fire burns vertically, not horizontally. 2 holes, 2 fires. The Kalinin Bay's flight deck looks like a sieve, smoke pouring from multiple wounds. But she's still steaming at 17 knots, still launching anti-aircraft fire, still maneuvering. The third Kamikaze arrives at 1,056 hours, a Yokosuka D-4 White Judy dive bomber carrying a 500-kilogram bomb. This one strikes the starboard side, forward of the island superstructure, and the detonation is catastrophic. The bomb punches through the flight deck, through the gallery deck, and explodes in the hangar deck below. 2 Wildcat fighters are destroyed instantly, their fuel tanks igniting, and for a moment it looks like the Kalinin Bay will burn like the USS Princeton did 2 days earlier, a massive internal fire consuming the ship from within. But Chief Warrant Officer Dennis O'Malley, leading the hangar deck fire party, sees something unexpected. The wooden flight deck above the fire has collapsed inward, creating a natural ventilation shaft. Smoke and flames vent upward, straight into the open air, instead of spreading horizontally through the hangar deck. The heat rises. The fire burns hot but localized. Foam on that wildcat. Keep water on the bulkheads. O'Malley directs his teams with the urgency of a man who understands he's witnessing something unprecedented. The fire is savage, the heat intense enough to blister paint 20 feet away. But it's not spreading. The wooden deck, by failing catastrophically, has prevented a catastrophic fire. By 11:05 hours, the third fire is under control. 3 kamikaze strikes, 3 holes in the flight deck, dozens of casualties. But the Kalinin Bay is still operational. Then the 4th aircraft arrives. The 4th kamikaze doesn't aim for the flight deck. Lieutenant Susumu Kaijitsu, flying a Zero that's been in service since 1942. The paint worn to bare metal, the engine rattling, sees the smoke pouring from a Kalinin Bay, and makes a tactical decision. The flight deck is already damaged. He'll aim for the island superstructure, decapitate the ship's command structure. At 1112 hours, Kaijitsu Zero slams into the island at the level of the flag bridge, just below the main mast. The impact shears through the superstructure's plating, the bomb detonating inside the radio room. 4 officers are killed instantly. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from a nearby Fanshawe Bay, loses communication with the Kalinin Bay for 8 critical minutes. But again, the damage is localized. The island superstructure is separate from the flight deck and hull. The fire burns through radio equipment, wiring, bunks, and administrative spaces, all replaceable, but doesn't threaten the ship's propulsion, steering, or aviation operations. Captain Thomas Bertram Williamson, commanding officer of the Kalinin Bay, directs operations from the auxiliary bridge on the stern. He's a 42-year-old Naval Academy graduate who's been at sea since 1925, and he understands something fundamental about his ship that the Japanese pilots don't. She was designed to take damage. The Casablanca-class carriers aren't fleet carriers built down to lower specifications. They're merchant hulls built up to minimal naval standards. Every system has redundancy. The reciprocating engines can run on one boiler if necessary. Steering can be controlled from 4 different locations. Fire mains run through multiple compartments with independent pumps. The ship is designed around the assumption that she'll be hit, and that when hit, the crew will need to keep her operational with whatever remains. Damage report. Williamson orders. 4 impacts, sir. Flight deck penetrated in 3 locations. Island superstructure damaged. Fires under control in all sections. Casualties. 14 dead, 31 wounded. We can still launch and recover aircraft if we clear the debris. Williamson looks at the flight deck. It's a ruin. Holes blown through the wooden planking. Scorch marks everywhere. Fire teams still spraying foam on smoldering sections. But the deck crew is already at work, dragging damaged planking aside, nailing steel plates over the worst holes, rigging emergency barriers around the damaged sections. How long to make the deck operational? 20 minutes, sir. We'll have a 100-foot section clear for emergency landings. 20 minutes. On a fleet carrier with an armored steel deck, damage like this would require dry dock repairs. But the Kalinin Bay's wooden deck can be patched with lumber, nails, and canvas. The damage control parties carry stacks of pre-cut Douglas fir planking for exactly this purpose, emergency repairs at sea. The 5th Kamikaze strikes at 1128 hours, just as the deck crew is nailing down the first emergency repairs. This one is piloted by a teenager, Ensign Hiroshi Nakamura, 17 years old, flying solo for only the 2nd time in his life. His approach is too fast and too shallow, and the Zero skips across the water before slamming into the Kalinin Bay's stern at waterline level. The impact is below the flight deck entirely, punching through the hull plating into the steering compartment. The damage is severe. Seawater floods the lower compartments. The rudder jams at 5 degrees starboard. But because the impact is below the waterline, there's no fire. The wooden flight deck above is completely undamaged. Damage control parties seal the compartment, shift ballast to compensate for the flooding, and switch to emergency steering from the auxiliary station. The Kalinin Bay begins steaming in slow circles. Her rudder jammed, but she's still afloat and still fighting. At 1,145 hours, 1 hour and 5 minutes after the first kamikaze strike, the sixth and final aircraft arrives. Lieutenant Masao Sato is flying a Judy dive bomber, one of the last operational aircraft from the carrier Zuikaku, sunk 2 days earlier at the Battle of Cape Engano. He's 31 years old, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raid, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. He knows how to aim. He knows where to hit. Sato selects the Kalinin Bay's waterline, amidships, just below the hangar deck. If he can rupture the hull at the engineering spaces, the ship will flood faster than the damage control parties can compensate. She'll capsize within the hour. The Judy drops from 3,000 feet in a perfect 70-degree dive. Anti-aircraft fire shreds the aircraft's wings, but Sato holds the dive, correcting for wind, adjusting for the carrier's movement. At 500 feet, he releases the 500-kilogram bomb and pulls up, or tries to. The damaged wings fail. The Judy disintegrates, tumbling into the sea. The bomb strikes the waterline exactly where Sato aimed. The explosion opens a 30-foot gash in the hull, flooding 2 boiler rooms and killing 18 men in the engineering spaces. Seawater pours into the ship at thousands of gallons per minute. The Kalinin Bay lists 7 degrees to starboard. Her speed drops to 9 knots. Every damage control alarm in the ship is screaming. This is the hit that should sink her. Lieutenant Commander Chrissy reaches the flooded boiler room at 1,152 hours, wading through waist-deep water that's rising 6 inches per minute. The lighting has failed. Emergency lanterns cast wild shadows, and the sound is overwhelming. Rushing water, screaming metal, steam escaping from ruptured pipes. "We need a seal frame 85. A petty officer shouts. The bulkhead's buckling. Chrissy sees the problem immediately. The bomb has blown a hole too large to patch from inside. Water pressure is forcing the adjacent bulkhead inward, and when it fails, the flooding will spread to the adjacent compartments. Then the next. Then the next. The Kalinin Bay will flood progressively until she capsizes, unless they can stop it from outside. Give me the collision mat," Chrissy orders, "and every diver we have." The collision mat is a massive canvas tarpaulin, 50 feet square, weighted with chains and designed to be dragged over hull breaches below the waterline. It's a technique from the days of wooden sailing ships, updated with modern materials, but fundamentally unchanged. Pull a flexible patch over the hole, let water pressure hold it in place, then pump out the flooded compartment. 3 sailors volunteer to go over the side. Bosun's mate second class Robert Palmer, seaman first class James Wu, and machinist's mate third class Anthony Ricci. They're wearing Kapok life jackets and clothwork gloves. No wetsuits, no diving equipment, just canvas and courage. The sea off Samar is 84 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sharks are a constant presence, drawn by blood and debris from the morning's battle. Palmer and Wu go into the water at 1,158 hours. They drag the collision mat around Kalinin Bay's wounded hull while Ricci, still on deck, feeds them line. The carrier is still underway at 9 knots, water boiling past the hull, the mat threatening to tear free with every surge. Palmer feels the current dragging him backward, feels the weight of the canvas and chains, feels his shoulders screaming with effort. They work for 37 minutes, positioning the mat, adjusting it, securing the corners to makeshift attachment points welded onto the hull plating. At 1,235 hours, the mat is in place. Water pressure forces it against the hull breach. The flooding slows from a torrent to a stream. Inside the ship, pumps begin winning the battle against the seawater. The list decreases from 7 degrees to 5 to 3. The engineering crews restore power to 1 boiler, then another. By 1,300 hours, the Kalinin Bay is making 13 knots. She's not supposed to be capable of this. No ship that's absorbed 6 kamikaze strikes in 2 hours should still be operational. The Japanese pilots who sacrificed themselves believed they were sinking escort carriers with every dive. Intelligence reports back to Mabalakad airfield will claim 3 CVs destroyed, including CV-68. But the Kalinin Bay refuses to die. By 1,400 hours, The flight deck is operational again. Deck crews have nailed steel plates over the 3 largest holes, rigged safety nets around the damaged sections, and marked a 200-foot section clear for aircraft operations. The first Wildcat lands at 1,407 hours, tailhook catching the number 3 arresting wire. The impact flexing the patched wooden deck, but holding. Ensign Jensen, watching from sky control, sees the pilot climb out of the cockpit and kiss the wooden deck planking. Later, Jensen will learn the pilot's name, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Lupo, and will buy him drinks in a bar in Pearl Harbor, where Lupo will explain what it felt like to trap aboard a carrier that looked like Swiss cheese, with smoke still rising from a dozen fires, knowing that the deck might collapse beneath his wheels. I figured if that deck could hold together through 6 kamikazes, Lupo will say, it could hold together through 1 landing. By sunset on October 25th, 1944, the battle off Samar is over. The Japanese center force has withdrawn, convinced it faced fleet carriers and heavy cruisers instead of escort carriers and destroyers. Taffy 3 has lost 2 escort carriers, USS Gamber Bay to surface gunfire, USS St. Lo to a kamikaze strike that penetrated her wooden deck and detonated in the bomb magazine, destroying her in minutes. But the Kalinin Bay steams east toward Manus Island, trailing oil and listing slightly to starboard, her wooden flight deck a patchwork of repairs, her hull showing scars that will never fully heal. She has absorbed 6 kamikaze strikes and survived. Her crew has fought fires, patched holes, sealed floods, and kept her operational through damage that would have crippled ships twice her size. The Japanese pilots who attacked her are dead, their sacrifice recorded in unit logs that praise their courage and confirm their kills. But those logs are wrong. CV-68 did not sink. She did not even withdraw from combat operations. 3 days later, on October 28th, the Kalinin Bay launches her aircraft for another strike mission against Japanese positions on Leyte. The wooden flight deck flexes and creaks under the weight of 14 Wildcat fighters and 12 Avenger torpedo bombers, but it holds. It always holds. The analysis comes later in naval architecture offices in Washington, D.C., where engineers study damage reports and photographs with the clinical detachment of men who don't have to smell the burning flesh or hear the screaming metal. They reconstruct the attacks, calculate impact angles, estimate explosive yields, and try to understand why CV-68 survived when CV-63 did not. The conclusion surprises them. The wooden flight deck, the feature that Japanese intelligence identified as a critical vulnerability, actually saved the ship, not despite being wooden, but because it was wooden. The technical explanation fills 300 pages of naval architecture reports, but the core principle is simple. Wooden decks fail differently than steel decks. When a kamikaze strikes an armored fleet carrier with a steel flight deck, the aircraft and bomb must penetrate several inches of hardened steel. If they succeed, the explosion is contained between the flight deck and hangar deck, an enclosed space where blast pressure has nowhere to go. The steel deck above conducts heat throughout the structure. Fires spread along the surface. Ammunition cooks off. Aviation fuel ignites and flows through the ship, following the contours of the steel decking. But when a kamikaze strikes a wooden flight deck, the aircraft punches through immediately. The explosion occurs in the open air or in the less confined space of the hangar deck. The wooden planking absorbs impact energy through catastrophic failure. It shatters, splinters, and burns, but in doing so it dissipates energy that would otherwise transfer to the ship's structure. The fires burn vertically, venting through the holes created by the impacts, rather than spreading horizontally. Commander Joseph Fox, the naval architect who writes the primary analysis, includes a memo that becomes famous in shipbuilding circles. The escort carriers survive not because they are strong, but because they are weak in precisely the right ways. They fail gracefully. The concept of graceful failure will inform naval architecture for the next 80 years. The Kalinin Bay becomes a case study in damage tolerance, cited in engineering textbooks, analyzed in war colleges, referenced in debates about armor versus resilience. But for the crew of CV-68, the engineering principles are irrelevant. They know only that their ship, mocked by the enemy, underestimated by their own navy, patched together from merchant hulls and scrap lumber, carried them through the worst naval battle of the Pacific War. The Kalinin Bay returns to combat operations in November 1944, supporting landings at Mindoro and Luzon. She survives the war, participates in the occupation of Japan, and is decommissioned in 1946. In 1947, she's sold for scrap, her wooden flight deck torn up and burned, her hull cut apart in a breaker's yard in New Jersey. But before she's scrapped, the Navy salvages sections of her flight deck, the Douglas fir planking that absorbed 6 kamikaze strikes, and distributes them to naval museums and training facilities. One section, complete with a patched hole and scorch marks, ends up at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, mounted on a wall in Mahan Hall with a brass plaque that reads, USS Kalinin Bay, KV 68. Flight Deck Section, Battle off Samar, October 25, 1944, 6 kamikaze strikes, 0 sunk. Midshipmen walk past it every day, most without noticing, on their way to classes in naval architecture and damage control. Those who stop to read the plaque sometimes reach out and touch the wood, running their fingers along the grain, feeling the repairs, imagining the fires and the impacts and the men who kept fighting with nothing but lumber and determination. The wood feels solid, unbreakable, which is exactly what it was. On that morning off Samar, when the kamikaze pilots learned that mockery is not a substitute for understanding, and that sometimes the things that look weakest are actually the hardest to destroy, the reports filter back to Mabalacat airfield slowly, carried by reconnaissance flights and decoded radio intercepts. 3 escort carriers confirmed sunk, the reports claim. Multiple others damaged and withdrawing. Admiral Onishi reads the reports with satisfaction. The special attack units have proven their worth. The exchange rate is favorable. But the reports are wrong. Of the 16 kamikaze aircraft launched against Taffy 3 on October 25th, only one sinks a carrier. The strike against USS St. Lo, which detonates the ship's bomb magazine through catastrophic bad luck. The other 15 aircraft achieve hits, cause damage, kill sailors, but fail to sink their targets. The USS Kalinin Bay, struck 6 times, remains operational. The USS Kalinin Bay, struck twice, continues flight operations. The USS Fanshawe Bay, struck once, recovers her aircraft, and returns to combat within hours. The wooden deck carriers that Japanese intelligence identified as easy targets prove to be the hardest to destroy, not because they're strong, but because they're resilient. Not because they're armored, but because they're adaptable. Not because they're impressive, but because they're practical. The lesson cost Japan 16 aircraft and 16 trained pilots, men who could have been used for conventional attack missions, for reconnaissance, for training the next generation. Instead, they're expended against targets that refuse to sink, based on assumptions that proved fatally wrong. In the months that follow, thousands more kamikaze pilots will dive into American ships. Some will succeed. Most will fail. The wooden-decked escort carriers will continue operating throughout the war, absorbing damage, patching holes, and proving that engineering is not about building things that never fail. It's about building things that fail in survivable ways. On November 15th, 1944, 3 weeks after the Battle off Samar, the Kalinin Bay launches strikes against Japanese positions on Luzon. Her flight deck still shows scars from the kamikaze attacks. Patched sections where new would contrast with old, steel plates riveted over the worst damage, scorch marks that won't scrub out. But she's operational. She's fighting. And somewhere in the waters off Samar, the spirits of 16 Japanese pilots who believed they'd sunk her are learning a final lesson about the danger of mockery, the cost of assumptions, and the resilience of American shipbuilding. The wooden coffins, it turns out, were built to last.